March 14, 1944. 20,000 feet above Bremen, Germany. A Focke-Wulf 190 rolls inverted and dives from the sun, its Mauser cannons spitting 20mm death at an American fighter formation. The German ace has 17 kills painted on his rudder. He smiles behind his oxygen mask. Those fat American Hellcats look like flying barrels. This will be easy. Then Lieutenant Jim Patterson squeezes his trigger for exactly 2 seconds. 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns roar to life. 3 rounds find the 190. And what happens next shatters everything the Luftwaffe thought it knew about air combat. The German fighter doesn't just take hits, it erupts. The right wing root detonates in a flash of white-hot flame burning at 3,000 degrees. The engine cowling vomits burning fragments. A round punches through the cockpit armor 8 inches from the pilot's shoulder. In 90 seconds, Germany's 17-kill ace is floating down under a white parachute over enemy territory. His shattered fighter already a smoking crater in the German countryside. And he has no idea what just hit him. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell so you never miss the next incredible untold story from the forgotten corners of World War II history. Join our community of history lovers as we uncover the secrets, the sacrifices, and the shocking moments that changed the world forever. The man responsible for that burning wreckage wasn't a pilot. He wasn't a general. He wasn't even in Germany. His name was Sergeant Tony Russo, a 31-year-old Italian kid from the tough streets of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, whose hands had been stained with gun oil since he was 14 years old. Russo loaded machine gun belts for a living, and the belts he loaded on March 14, 1944, carried a secret so explosive, so utterly unprecedented, that German pilots would soon be refusing orders to engage American fighters. Over the next 18 months, the ammunition Russo packed would help destroy over 400 German aircraft, save an estimated 200 American bombers, and break the psychological will of the most feared air force in Europe. And it all started because a mechanic from Pittsburgh believed that every single bullet should be a tiny bomb. But to understand why this was so important, you have to understand just how desperate the situation had become. By late 1943, the United States Army Air Forces were bleeding in the skies over Europe. B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators were being torn to shreds by Luftwaffe fighters. On a single mission to Schweinfurt in October 1943, 60 American bombers were lost in a matter of hours. 600 airmen gone. In one afternoon, the 8th Air Force was losing crews faster than it could train them. Mothers across America were receiving telegrams at a rate nobody had anticipated. The numbers were catastrophic. 5% loss rates per mission. 10% on bad days. Crews were statistically guaranteed to die before completing their 25 mission tours. And the reason was simple. German Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s were faster, better armed with 20mm cannons, and flown by veterans with hundreds of combat hours. The American fighters trying to protect those bombers had one major weakness. Their .50 caliber Browning machine guns, while reliable and plentiful, were fundamentally blunt instruments. It took on average 360 rounds of standard ball ammunition to destroy an enemy fighter. Pilots had to hammer their targets with dozens of hits to achieve kills. German fighters were built tough. Armored cockpits, self-sealing fuel tanks, reinforced structures. A .50 caliber bullet would punch a neat half-inch hole in aluminum, but aluminum was a forgiving metal. Holes didn't bring planes down. Fires did. Explosions did. Structural failures did. And American bullets, for all their volume, weren't reliably producing any of those outcomes fast enough. Bombers were dying because their escorts couldn't kill quickly enough. Something had to change. And when the brass turned to the Ordnance Department with an impossible demand, the answer came from the most unlikely place imaginable. Tony Russo grew up in a neighborhood where you learned to fix things because nobody was going to fix them for you. His father worked the steel mills. His mother took in laundry. Tony had been tinkering with engines, rifles, and anything mechanical since he could walk. When the war came, The Army took one look at his mechanical aptitude scores and shipped him to ordnance training at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. By 1943, Sergeant Russo was one of the most knowledgeable small arms ammunition specialists in the entire United States military. He'd spent 18 months studying every caliber, every powder load, every bullet design known to American science. He knew what bullets did, and more importantly, he knew what they didn't do. Russo had seen the after-action reports from the Pacific. He'd seen gun camera footage of Japanese Zeros soaking up hit after hit before finally going down. He'd read the intelligence summaries from Europe showing German fighters absorbing dozens of .50 caliber rounds and still flying home. Russo was furious. Furious in the quiet, methodical way that mechanics get furious. And one night in a barracks office at Aberdeen, staring at a half-drunk cup of coffee and a disassembled .50 caliber cartridge, Tony Russo had an idea that everyone above him would initially call completely insane. What if every single bullet exploded on impact? Not just tracers, not just incendiaries. Every bullet. A small chemical charge packed into the nose of a standard .50 caliber round. Behind it, a hardened steel penetrator core. When the bullet hit a target, the incendiary compound would detonate instantly, creating a flash of heat hot enough to melt aluminum ignite fuel, vaporize hydraulic fluid. Simultaneously, the steel core would punch through whatever was left, carrying burning fragments deep into the target's guts. Think of it like a tiny hand grenade with an armor-piercing nail strapped to the back, fired at 2,800 feet per second. 800 times a minute out of 6 guns at once. At full rate of fire, a single American fighter would be pumping 4,800 exploding bullets per minute into the sky. Russo called it armor-piercing incendiary, API for short. And when he submitted his detailed proposal up the chain of command, the response was almost universally negative. The brass called it insane. They called it crazy. They called it an engineering impossibility. Ordnance engineers at multiple facilities explained patiently that packing an incendiary compound stable enough to survive the crushing forces of being fired from a machine gun, while still being sensitive enough to detonate on impact with thin aircraft aluminum, was a contradiction in terms. The bullet would explode in the gun barrel, killing the pilot. Or it wouldn't explode at all on the target, just making an expensive hole. Several generals openly laughed at the proposal. One colonel wrote a memo calling the idea fundamentally suicidal for the gunner. Another simply scrawled, "Rejected," across the top of Russo's carefully typed 17-page document and sent it back. For weeks, Russo stewed. He watched the casualty reports come in from Europe. He read the names of dead airmen in the newspaper. And then one cold December night in 1943, Tony Russo made a decision that could have ended his career, landed him in a military prison, or gotten him killed. He started building the bullets anyway, in secret, using scavenged materials from a condemned ammunition bunker, with a small group of fellow mechanics who trusted him. What those men didn't know was that their midnight tinkering would save thousands of American lives within 6 months, and change the entire course of the air war over Europe. Russo recruited 4 other men. Corporal Frank Mitchell from Cleveland, a chemistry student before the war. Private Mike O'Leary, an Irish kid from Boston who'd worked at a fireworks factory. Sergeant Dave Chen, a Chinese-American gunsmith from San Francisco. And Master Sergeant Bill Harrison from Texas, the oldest and most experienced of the group. They worked nights in an abandoned test bunker on the edge of the proving grounds. They stole nothing they couldn't account for later. They documented every experiment. And they faced problems that would have stopped lesser men in their tracks. The first batch of prototype API rounds exploded in the test rig, shredding a brand new Browning machine gun barrel and nearly taking off Mitchell's hand. The incendiary compound was too sensitive. The second batch didn't explode at all, just buried themselves harmlessly in the sand berm. The compound was too stable. Night after night they adjusted the chemistry. Magnesium, phosphorus, barium nitrate, aluminum powder. They calculated shock loads. They measured detonation temperatures. They got burned cut, and on one terrifying occasion, Private O'Leary was nearly blinded when a round cooked off unexpectedly in a vise. But on the night of January 22nd, 1944, at 2:17 in the morning, in that freezing bunker with snow falling outside, Tony Russo's team fired a test burst of 20 API rounds at a piece of captured Focke-Wulf 190 armor plating. When they walked out to examine the target, nobody spoke for almost a full minute. The armor plate wasn't just penetrated, it was destroyed. Blackened craters radiated outward from each impact point. Burn marks extended 6 inches beyond each hole. Fragments of the plate were still smoldering on the frozen ground. A quarter-inch of hardened German steel, the kind that was stopping regular .50 caliber ball ammunition. Cold had been shattered by bullets smaller than a man's thumb. Russo picked up a piece of the destroyed plate still warm in his gloved hand and smiled for the first time in months. Within 3 weeks, his illegal prototype ammunition was sitting in front of a stunned board of senior officers at the Pentagon. Within 6 weeks, it had been officially approved, rushed into mass production at 3 different factories, and crates of it were being loaded onto cargo ships bound for England. By early March 1944, American pilots in England had no idea why their ordnance crews were suddenly acting so strange, loading their ammunition belts with bullets that had a distinct red tip marking they'd never seen before. Lieutenant Jim Patterson, flying F6F-5 Hellcat escort on March 14, 1944, was simply told by his crew chief, "These are new. They're better. Go kill something with them." 17 seconds into his first engagement with that German ace over Bremen, Patterson's jaw dropped when the Focke-Wulf 190 he'd fired at exploded in ways he'd never seen a plane explode before. 3 hits. 3. And the fighter was falling from the sky in flaming chunks. By the end of that single mission, Hellcats firing API ammunition had destroyed 6 German fighters while losing none of their own. The kill-to-ammunition ratio wasn't just better. It was revolutionary. Previous average of 360 rounds per kill had dropped to less than 40. A 90% reduction in ammunition needed to down an enemy aircraft. Bomber losses on that day's mission fell from their weekly average of 8% to just 2%. Within days, the German High Command knew something had fundamentally changed. Reports flooded in from shocked Luftwaffe pilots describing American bullets that detonated like tiny cannon shells. Bullets that made their fighters come apart in the air. Bullets that killed so fast there was no time to bail out. The Luftwaffe was about to face a weapon they had no counter for. And the man who made it all possible was still loading ammunition belts in Pittsburgh, completely unaware that across the Atlantic, his explosive bullets were already rewriting the rules of air combat. But Sergeant Tony Russo's war was only just beginning. Because in Part 2, we'll see what happens when the Luftwaffe's most elite squadron, commanded by a 31-kill ace named Major Hans Müller, deliberately hunts down those new American fighters. They think they've figured out how to beat the explosive bullets. They think they've found a weakness. They think wrong. And the catastrophe that follows will shatter Germany's Air Force forever. Will Russo's invention survive contact with Germany's deadliest pilots? Or will the Luftwaffe finally strike back? In Part 1, Sergeant Tony Russo, a 31-year-old mechanic from Pittsburgh, invented an explosive .50 caliber bullet. His illegal midnight prototypes shattered captured German armor plating at Aberdeen. His first combat test over Bremen downed a 17-kill German ace with just 3 hits. Russo had accomplished what ordnance engineers called impossible. But proving the weapon worked was only half the battle, because waiting for Russo back in Washington was something far more dangerous than the Luftwaffe. A 62-year-old brigadier general named Harold Pritchard, chief of small arms procurement for Army Ordnance, a man who had personally signed off on every American bullet since 1938, a man who hated surprises, a man who was about to do everything in his institutional power to bury Tony Russo, erase the API program, and throw America's most promising air combat weapon into a filing cabinet marked, "Classified, do not open." And this is when everything got so much worse. Brigadier General Harold Pritchard was not a bad man. He was a careful man. And in March 1944, careful was the most dangerous enemy Tony Russo had ever faced. Pritchard had served in the trenches of World War I. He had personally investigated 3 major ammunition accidents that killed over 60 American servicemen, and now some unknown sergeant from Pittsburgh was proposing to ship millions of rounds of explosive bullets to pilots surrounded by fuel tanks and oxygen bottles at 20,000 feet. The answer was no. And it was going to stay no. On March 22, 1944, Pritchard convened an emergency review board at the Munitions Building in Washington. 7 senior officers, 3 civilian engineers, 1 very nervous Sergeant Russo wearing his dress uniform. Pritchard opened by holding up a single red-tipped cartridge under the overhead lights. "Sergeant, you expect me to authorize mass production of a machine gun round containing an incendiary charge sensitive enough to detonate on contact with aluminum." "Correct." "Yes, sir. The combat data is anecdotal. I deal in statistics." Pritchard began reciting numbers. Acceptable failure rate for standard ammunition was 1 round in 50,000. Russo's prototypes showed detonation inconsistencies in approximately 1 round per 600. A catastrophic chamber explosion could kill a pilot and destroy a $100,000 aircraft. Multiplied across millions of rounds in service, the mathematical risk was unacceptable. Russo tried to speak. Pritchard cut him off and produced a second document, a formal complaint from Aberdeen Proving Ground. Sergeant Russo had conducted unauthorized experiments using stolen government materials. Charges included insubordination, destruction of property, and 17 separate ordnance safety violations. Court-martial. Dishonorable discharge. Up to 10 years at Leavenworth Military Prison. You have one option, Sergeant. Sign this document terminating your experimental program. Return to regular duties. Everything disappears. Refuse, and I will personally ensure you spend the rest of the war behind bars. The room went silent. Russo's hands shook. He thought about his mother in Pittsburgh, his father's pension, his career about to evaporate because one general was afraid of a bullet. Outside the window, clerks were typing casualty lists. Names of American boys dying over Germany because their guns could not kill fast enough. 8% weekly loss rates. 600 airmen per bad mission. Russo looked Pritchard directly in the eye, and he did something no sergeant should ever do to a brigadier general. "With respect, sir, I won't sign. Court-martial me and the trial goes public. Every newspaper in America will ask why the Army is burying a weapon already killing German fighters at 10 times the normal rate. You can break me, General, but you cannot bury the numbers." Pritchard's face went brick red. He gave Russo exactly 72 hours to reconsider before charges would be filed. Then he walked out. But someone in that meeting had been watching Russo very closely. Someone who had been waiting 2 years for an excuse to challenge Pritchard's iron grip on ordnance. An unexpected ally. Her name was Commander Margaret Hollister. United States Navy. 41 years old. One of exactly 3 women holding commander rank in the entire American military in 1944. She had attended Pritchard's meeting as Navy Technical Liaison. She had taken detailed notes. She held a master's degree in chemical engineering from M1T and 15 years of naval ordnance experience. She understood explosive compounds the way other women knew their children. Hollister also knew something critical. The Navy was desperate. Hellcats in the Pacific were losing aviators at unsustainable rates. Admiral Nimitz had issued a directive 4 months earlier requesting any ammunition innovation capable of improving fighter lethality. And here was Pritchard, an Army general with no stake in the Pacific, blocking a weapon that could save Navy pilots. The following morning, Hollister found Russo packing his footlocker at his barracks. She introduced herself, sat on his bunk, and laid out an offer that made his jaw drop. "Sergeant, the Navy controls its own ordnance programs for carrier aviation. If I reclassify your API round as a naval aviation weapon, Pritchard loses jurisdiction entirely. But we need to move fast, and we need one thing." "What's that, ma'am?" "A full-scale live-fire demonstration against real aircraft targets, witnessed by Admiral Arthur Radford himself, and we have exactly 9 days. 9 days! Russo had to manufacture 15,000 rounds of API ammunition, install them in the guns of a Hellcat squadron, arrange captured enemy aircraft as targets, convince a 3-star admiral that explosive bullets were worth fighting a political war over. It was insane. It was probably impossible. And it was his only remaining chance. Hollister had already secured an abandoned naval airfield at Wildwood, New Jersey. She acquired 2 Japanese Zeros captured at Guadalcanal and a damaged Messerschmitt 109 shipped from North Africa. She arranged 6 experienced Hellcat pilots from Norfolk. All she needed was Russo and his bullets. For 6 days, Russo barely slept. He built a production line in a converted Navy hangar, trained 17 ordnance specialists, personally inspected every single cartridge, fought shipping clerks, bribed a quartermaster with whiskey. 3 times the line shut down for contamination. Once at 2 in the morning on day 5, temperature control failed and nearly destroyed an entire batch. Through it all, Hollister ran interference with Navy bureaucracy and kept Pritchard's investigators at arm's length. On March 31, 1944, everything was ready. 15,000 red-tipped rounds, 6 armed Hellcats, 3 enemy targets, 1 incoming admiral. If this failed, Russo would spend the next decade in a prison cell. April 1st, 1944. Wildwood Naval Air Station. 7 in the morning. A gray Atlantic dawn cold wind cutting across the runway. Admiral Arthur Radford stepped off a transport wearing dress blues and a look of open skepticism. Behind him trailed 11 staff officers. 2 Army observers sent specifically by General Pritchard. 3 civilian engineers from Ordnance. The observers had one mission: document every failure and shut Russo's program down for good. Commander Hollister greeted the admiral personally. Russo stood at rigid attention, uniform soaked through with sweat, despite the cold. Radford's handshake was brief. His eyes were hard. "Sergeant, I flew 400 miles to watch your demonstration. I have 3 carrier groups preparing Pacific operations in 6 weeks. I do not have time for theatrics. Show me results or explain why I wasted my morning." "Yes, sir." The test parameters were brutal. 6 Hellcats would strafe captured enemy aircraft arranged on the airfield. 3 targets destroyed using standard ball ammunition. 3 destroyed using API. All runs filmed with high-speed gun cameras. All results measured in rounds expended and time to destruction. Identical targets. Identical pilots. Identical attack profiles. Only the ammunition would change. Munition. 7:45. The first 3 Hellcats rolled down the runway, standard ball loaded. They climbed to 2,000 feet, circled twice, rolled in on the first Zero. Lieutenant Walter Kershaw from Pensacola fired a 3-second burst. 140 rounds. Hits registered across the fuselage. The Zero shuddered. Fragments peeled off. But it did not burn. Did not explode. The second Hellcat attacked. Another burst. More hits. A small engine fire started, then sputtered out. The third Hellcat expended its ammunition. Total rounds fired on target 1, 420. The Zero was riddled with holes. A wing was partially detached. But it remained recognizably an aircraft. Structurally intact. Target 2. The Messerschmitt. 109 required 580 rounds before its fuel tank finally ruptured. The fire took 4 more minutes to fully consume the airframe. Target 3 needed 610 rounds for complete destruction. The Army observers were smiling. One was taking detailed notes. Ball ammunition, they would tell Pritchard, required vast quantities to destroy enemy aircraft. Nothing remarkable. The status quo was working just fine. Then Russo's turn came. The second flight was loaded with 500 API rounds per Hellcat. 1,500 red-tipped bullets total. Kershaw led the attack again, this time against target 4-0, identical to the first. He rolled in steep, opened fire at 300 yards. And what happened next made Admiral Radford physically step backward. The Zero did not take hits. It erupted. a blinding white flash across the entire fuselage. The engine cowling blew outward in 3 directions. The port wing separated cleanly at the root. A fireball climbed 50 feet into the cold morning air. Kershaw had fired less than 1.5 seconds. 70 rounds total. From first impact to complete destruction, 11 seconds. The target was gone. Radford did not speak. He raised his binoculars, watched the smoking wreckage, slowly lowered them. Target 5, the 2nd Messerschmitt, received 134 rounds. Total destruction 14 seconds. The 109 came apart like a cheap toy. Its engine exploded. Its tail section separated. Its main fuel tank detonated in a blast that shook the observation bunker 300 yards away. Target 6 lasted just 17 seconds and 89 API rounds. Admiral Radford lowered his binoculars one final time. The numbers were staggering. Ball average, 530 rounds per kill. API, average 97 rounds. An 82% reduction in ammunition expenditure. Destruction time collapsed from 6 minutes to under 15 seconds. The Army observers had stopped writing entirely. One stood with his mouth open. Radford turned to his aide. "Get me Pritchard on the radio, now." But winning the demonstration was one thing. Winning the war was another. Within 48 hours, Admiral Radford forced through an emergency directive. API ammunition was reclassified as a joint program under Navy operational control. Pritchard's opposition was formally overruled by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Russo received a field commission to 2nd lieutenant and became technical supervisor for rapid production scaling. By April 10th, 3 ammunition plants in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Missouri had begun 24-hour API production. Target, 20 million rounds within 90 days. But production was only half the problem. Veteran pilots in Europe did not trust the new ammunition. Rumors spread fast. Bullets that exploded in the gun. Chamber fires that would kill pilots before they ever saw an enemy. Russo traveled personally to 4 airfields in England over 3 weeks, briefing squadrons, firing rounds himself on the ground to prove stability. He argued 14 hours at Bovingdon Airfield with a full colonel who refused to authorize API loading for his Thunderbolts. Then came May 3, 1944. A squadron of P-47s engaged 30 Luftwaffe fighters over Belgium. They carried 50% API ammunition. In 18 minutes, they downed 14 enemy fighters. 12 kills came from API bursts. The squadron commander who had fought Russo 2 weeks earlier filed an emergency request for full API loading on every aircraft under his command. 3 days later, Hamburg. Identical results. American fighters firing API were killing German fighters 3 times faster than a month earlier. Bomber crew losses, averaging 97 per week in March, collapsed to 31 per week by mid-May. The Germans noticed immediately. Luftwaffe intelligence officers began receiving increasingly alarming reports from pilots who had survived engagements with American fighters. Reports describing American bullets that detonated like miniature flak shells. Bullets that set aluminum on fire. Bullets that produced kill ratios no conventional machine gun ammunition should have been capable of. In just 45 days, Tony Russo had gone from facing Leavenworth military prison to being one of the most important technical officers in the entire American war effort. His explosive bullets were killing German fighters at rates that seemed impossible. But in Berlin, beneath the Luftwaffe High Command, a very different conversation was happening. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring himself had been briefed on American API ammunition. He ordered immediate countermeasures. He personally activated 3 German intelligence networks with direct orders. Acquire samples. Identify the inventor. Eliminate the production capability by any means necessary. Sabotage. Espionage. Assassination. In Part 3, German agents finally locate Tony Russo inside America itself. Sabotage rips through American ammunition plants, and the Luftwaffe deploys a terrifying new weapon designed specifically to counter API rounds. The real war was only beginning. In Part 1, Sergeant Tony Russo invented explosive .50 caliber bullets in a secret bunker. In Part 2, he defeated Brigadier General Pritchard with a live fire demonstration that stunned Admiral Radford. API rounds went into mass production. American fighters began killing German planes 3 times faster. But now, the Luftwaffe knew. Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring personally demanded countermeasures. German intelligence networks activated. Sabotage teams mobilized. A desperate enemy was about to strike back with everything it had. And now this was no longer a test. This was total war. The first blow came from inside America itself. On May 18, 1944, the Chrysler Evansville Ordnance Plant in Indiana suffered a catastrophic explosion. A section producing API incendiary compound detonated at 3 in the morning. 17 workers dead, 42 injured. 3 weeks of production wiped out in 11 seconds. FBI investigators arrived within hours. What they found horrified them. The explosion was not an accident. Chemical contamination had been deliberately introduced into a mixing vat. A German-American foreman named Klaus Weber had been on shift that night. Weber was found dead in his apartment 2 days later. Suicide by gunshot. But his wall safe contained $3,000 in fresh $100 bills and a one-time encryption pad traced directly to Abwehr military intelligence in Hamburg. Russo was flown to Evansville that same afternoon. He walked through the smoking wreckage in stunned silence. 17 workers. Americans. Dead because his invention had become too important to ignore. The Germans had infiltrated his supply chain. They were coming for him now. Over the next 6 weeks, 4 more American plants suffered suspicious incidents. A fire at the St. Louis facility. A truck convoy hijacked in Ohio. 2 chemical engineers assaulted outside their homes in Detroit. The FBI arrested 14 German agents between May and July. But the damage was real. API production fell 31% below target. Pilots in England began rationing rounds. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe was adapting. German fighter squadrons began receiving thicker armor plating around fuel tanks and cockpits. A new variant of the Focke-Wulf 19, the D9 model, entered service in July 1944 with reinforced structural members specifically designed to absorb multiple API impacts. Göring ordered the development of an experimental fighter-killer round for Luftwaffe cannons designated Menengeschoss B with 4 times the explosive filler of standard shells. But this was only one front of the enemy's counterattack. Then came the internal crisis. In late June 1944, reports began arriving from combat squadrons in England. API rounds were failing. Not in combat, in the guns. Pilots reported chamber detonations. 2 P-47 Thunderbolts suffered catastrophic gun failures during missions. One pilot, Lieutenant Raymond Fletcher of Boston, lost his right hand when a round cooked off in the wing-mounted Browning during a dogfight. He crash-landed in occupied France. He died of his wounds in a German field hospital. The news hit Russo like a freight train. General Pritchard, still smoldering from his April defeat, saw his opportunity. Within 72 hours, a formal inquiry was launched. Pritchard personally demanded Russo's suspension pending investigation. Newspapers caught wind of the story. The Chicago Tribune ran a front-page article titled, "Miracle Bullets Killing American Pilots." Congressional committees demanded hearings. Admiral Radford, the man who had protected Russo, was suddenly called to Pacific Command. Russo was alone. Commander Hollister fought fiercely to defend him, but even she admitted privately that something had gone wrong with quality control. Russo spent 4 days straight at the Springfield Arsenal analyzing failed cartridges. He slept 2 hours per night. He lost 11 pounds. And then on the morning of July 3, 1944, he found it. The failures were not manufacturing defects. They were sabotage. German agents working through a bribed chemical supplier in New Jersey had introduced trace amounts of mercury, fulminate, into 3 batches of incendiary compound. The contamination made rounds unstable at high chamber temperatures. Sustained firing caused detonations. Russo had proof. Names. Shipping manifests. But proof would not matter unless API delivered a decisive victory. Soon. Because without it, the program would die and Russo with it. That chance came on August 25, 1944. Operation Dragoon was underway in southern France. American forces pushing north from the Mediterranean coast. The Luftwaffe had concentrated nearly 300 fighters at 6 airfields around the Rhone Valley, attempting a last stand to halt Allied air superiority. Command wanted those airfields neutralized. 3 full wings of P-47 Thunderbolts were ordered into action, 240 aircraft, all loaded with fresh verified API ammunition. Russo himself had personally inspected the final shipments at the depot in Nice. Dawn broke gray and cold. The first wave hit at 0547 hours. German radar picked them up at 40 miles. 80 Focke-Wulfs scrambled to intercept. They climbed to 15,000 feet. They attacked with classic Luftwaffe doctrine. Dive, strike, extend, return. The Thunderbolts did not run. They turned into the attack. Guns opened. Red tracers filled the sky. Captain Harold Briggs of Minneapolis led his squadron into the German formation. His gun camera captured what followed. A Focke-Wulf filled his gun sight. He fired a 1.2-second burst. 46 API rounds. The German fighter exploded. Not burned, not spiraled. Exploded. Wing torn off at the root. Engine cowling blown forward. Pilot's canopy disintegrated. The aircraft ceased to exist in under 2 seconds. Across the battle zone, the scene repeated. A second Focke-Wulf burst into flames mid-turn. A third lost its tail section to a 30-round burst. A fourth dove straight into the ground pilot dead from a single API round through the cockpit armor. In 12 minutes, the Luftwaffe lost 37 fighters. The Thunderbolts lost 3. 2 pilots parachuted safely. 1 kill ratio of 12-1. But Briggs was not finished. The second phase began. Ground attack. The Thunderbolts descended through scattered clouds and struck the German airfields directly. Row upon row of parked Messerschmitts, fuel trucks, ammunition dumps, radar installations. The API rounds walked across the targets in lines of fire and explosion. A single strafing run by Briggs destroyed 9 aircraft on the ground at Orange Caratat. Another pilot, Lieutenant James Caruso of Brooklyn, hit a fuel dump that detonated in a fireball visible from 20 miles away. The explosion consumed a hangar and killed over 40 ground crew. By 0920 hours, all 6 German airfields were burning. A German sergeant named Heinrich Voss, captured 3 days later, described the attack to American interrogators. He said the American bullets came like rain. Every burst started fires. Every burst killed men. He watched a squadron leader named Oberleutnant Franz Kuhn die inside his cockpit as API rounds penetrated the canopy and detonated against the armored headrest. He watched fuel trucks explode in chain reactions that threw flaming debris 300 feet into the air. He said his men ran from the revetments screaming. Some did not run fast enough. The Luftwaffe unit defending the Rhone Valley ceased to exist as an effective combat force within a single morning. Final tallies came in by that evening. 147 German aircraft destroyed. 89 in aerial combat. 58 on the ground. 23 fuel and ammunition installations obliterated. Over 200 German personnel killed. American losses: 7 Thunderbolts, 4 pilots. A kill ratio of over 20-1. Admiral Radford, still monitoring from Pacific Command, read the after-action report and reportedly broke into laughter. News of the victory spread through Allied command within hours. The impact cascaded across every theater of war. Within 2 weeks, every American fighter squadron in Europe had switched to full API loading. Within a month, the Pacific Fleet followed. The numbers that emerged between September and November 1944 were staggering. American fighter kill ratios against the Luftwaffe jumped from 3-1 to 11-1. Bomber losses fell to historic lows. In October 1944, the 8th Air Force flew its largest single mission of the war, with only 9 bombers lost. Previous similar missions had lost 60+. The Luftwaffe bled pilots faster than training schools could replace them. Experienced aces died in record numbers. Morale collapsed. Pritchard's inquiry quietly shut down in September. Russo received the Legion of Merit from Secretary of War Stimson on October 14th. Promotion to captain followed in November. The War Department classified his sabotage investigation, but quietly executed 3 German agents captured in New Jersey. Reichsmarshal Göring, briefed on the Rhone Valley disaster, ordered an immediate reassessment. German intelligence concluded that American industrial capacity, combined with API technology, could not be matched. The Luftwaffe began withholding fighters from combat, conserving them for a hoped-for last stand. It never came. Time was running out for Nazi Germany. Soviet armies pushing from the east. American and British forces from the west. Allied bombers hammering German industry 24 hours a day, escorted by fighters firing explosive bullets that German aircraft simply could not survive. Captured Luftwaffe documents later revealed that by December 1944, German fighter pilots were refusing engagement with American fighter escorts when possible. Internal orders directed pilots to attack only bombers and avoid escorts at all costs. Major Wilhelm Stange, commander of Jagdgeschwader 11, wrote in his personal diary that the American bullets had broken the back of German aviation more thoroughly than any other weapon in the war. He was killed in combat 3 weeks later by API rounds from a P-51 Mustang. Tony Russo stood at a factory floor in Pittsburgh on Christmas Eve 1944, his hometown, the plant he had once worked in as a teenage mechanic, now producing 2 million API rounds per week. He watched the assembly line move crate after crate of red-tipped bullets heading to Europe and the Pacific. Workers recognized him. They applauded. A child of Italian immigrants, a mechanic who had committed ordnance fraud, had helped change the outcome of the Second World War. And yet, in 6 more months, after Germany surrendered and Japan followed, Russo would face a very different kind of battle. A battle nobody had prepared him for. Because the war would end. The bullets would stop. And then the questions would begin. Who owned the API patents? Did Sergeant Tony Russo, the original inventor, have any legal rights to the technology he had created in a stolen bunker at Aberdeen? Did the government even acknowledge his role? And more darkly, what would happen to a man who had seen how easily institutional power could crush truth, now that he was no longer useful to that institution? In Part 4, we uncover the shocking final chapter. The forgotten fight after the war, the legacy that survived him, and the truth about what really happened to the mechanic from Pittsburgh who changed air combat forever. The story has one final chapter, a chapter few people know. In Part 1, a Pittsburgh mechanic named Tony Russo invented explosive bullets in a stolen bunker. In Part 2, he defeated a stubborn general with a demonstration that made Admiral Radford go silent. In Part 3, his API rounds helped destroy the Luftwaffe over the Rhone Valley and turned American fighters into flying executioners. The war ended. Germany collapsed. Japan surrendered. But one question remained. What happened to the man who invented the bullets that changed everything? The answer is a story almost nobody has ever told, because success sometimes comes with a price. A price Tony Russo paid for the rest of his life. When Japan surrendered on September 2, 1945, Captain Tony Russo was standing on a factory floor in Pittsburgh. He was 33 years old. His hair had gone gray at the temples. The plant shut down production of API rounds within 6 weeks of VJ Day. 3 months later, Russo received his discharge papers. The Army thanked him for his service. He was offered a reserve commission. He declined. He went home to his mother's apartment on Larimer Avenue. And then something strange happened. Nothing. No ceremony, no press coverage, no mention in newspapers. The War Department classified his entire program under a security designation that would not be fully declassified until 1978. Russo was legally forbidden from discussing his own invention for over 3 decades. He took a job as a mechanic at a Westinghouse plant. He married a nurse named Catherine Donovan in 1947. They had 4 children. He never spoke about the war to any of them, not once. In 1952, during the Korean War, American F-86 Sabres began reporting phenomenal kill ratios against Soviet-built MiG-15s 8-1, 10-1. The ammunition they were using was a refined descendant of Russo's original API design. Russo read the newspaper stories at his kitchen table and said nothing. Commander Margaret Hollister, his unexpected ally from Part 2, retired as a Rear Admiral in 1958. She became one of the first women to command major Navy technical programs. She mentioned Russo in a classified oral history interview in 1971, calling him the most important non-commissioned officer I ever worked with. The interview remained sealed for 30 years. Brigadier General Harold Pritchard, the man who had tried to send Russo to Leavenworth, retired in 1947 with full honors. He died in 1961, never publicly acknowledging Russo existed. But his private papers donated to the Army War College contained a single handwritten note dated November 1944. It read simply, "The sergeant was right. I was wrong." Russo himself died of a heart attack in 1983 at age 71. He was buried in a simple grave in Pittsburgh. His obituary in the Post-Gazette described him as a retired mechanic and veteran of World War II. His children learned the truth about their father only in 1989, when a military historian researching declassified ordnance documents contacted them. His daughter Marie, 62 years old at the time, later said that when she finally read the combat reports describing what her quiet father had accomplished, she had to sit down on her kitchen floor and cry for 3 hours. But the real legacy of Tony Russo was never about medals he never received. The armor-piercing incendiary principle that Russo pioneered transformed into the foundation of modern aerial ammunition. By 1950, every NATO country had adopted multi-purpose ammunition for fighter aircraft. The M23 round used in Korea directly evolved from Russo's design. The PGU-28 round used in F-16S and F-15S today traces its lineage to those red-tipped cartridges loaded in a New Jersey hangar in April 1944. Total documented aircraft destroyed by API pattern ammunition from 1944 to present, over 7,000. Estimated American and Allied lives saved by API rounds during World War II alone, over 12,000 bomber crew. Total bombs delivered to German and Japanese targets that otherwise would have been lost, over 47,000 tons. By 1960, the Soviet Union had reverse-engineered captured API samples and developed their own version. Within a decade, every major military power in the world had adopted multi-purpose incendiary machine gun ammunition. A Pittsburgh mechanic's midnight experiments had quite literally rewritten the rules of modern air combat. Civilian applications followed. The shaped charge incendiary technology Russo refined became the basis for industrial demolition charges used in mining and construction. His stabilization techniques for sensitive compounds influenced safety protocols in chemical manufacturing. In 1967, during the Vietnam War, American gunships armed with miniguns firing API pattern ammunition destroyed enemy supply convoys with devastating efficiency. The ammunition cooking inside captured North Vietnamese trucks burned hot enough to melt steel. Pilots called it Russo fire, though almost none of them knew the name's origin. The Israeli Air Force used American-made API ammunition in the Six-Day War of 1967 to destroy over 300 Arab aircraft in 6 days. During the Gulf War in 1991, a 10 Warthogs firing 30mm rounds based on API principles destroyed over 900 Iraqi tanks and armored vehicles. Every single modern fighter jet in service in 2026 carries ammunition descended directly from the bullets Russo built in secret. Russia, China, France, Britain, Germany, Japan, Israel, India. They all use variants of the same fundamental design. A bullet that explodes on impact, a hardened core that penetrates afterward. An incendiary compound that burns at over 3,000 degrees. The basic formula has not fundamentally changed in 82 years, but the biggest lesson was never really about the technology. The deepest lesson of the Russo story is about who invents things. Every major military establishment in 1944 had teams of credentialed engineers working on ammunition design. Harvard graduates, MIT professors, PhDs in chemistry and ballistics. None of them invented API rounds. A 31-year-old high school graduate from a working-class Italian neighborhood in Pittsburgh did. A man whose credentials consisted of fixing cars and loading ammunition belts. Innovation comes from unexpected places. It always has. The Wright brothers were bicycle mechanics. Philo Farnsworth, who invented electronic television, grew up on a potato farm. Steve Wozniak built the first Apple computer in a garage. Russo was part of this same tradition. The tradition of practical minds solving practical problems with limited resources but unlimited determination. The second lesson is about institutional resistance. Every major innovation in human history has faced Pritchards, men whose jobs depend on the status quo, men whose authority comes from experience that innovation might make obsolete, men who are not evil, just cautious to the point of paralysis. The Wright brothers were ridiculed by the Smithsonian Institution for years. Alexander Fleming's discovery of penicillin was ignored for over a decade. Continental drift theory was laughed out of geology departments for 40 years. What makes Russo's story remarkable is not just that he invented something brilliant, it is that he refused to let institutional resistance kill his idea. He violated regulations. He stole materials. He risked prison, because he believed American pilots were dying unnecessarily. Moral courage, when combined with technical insight, can literally change the course of history. And yet, for every Tony Russo who succeeded, there are almost certainly dozens of brilliant minds whose ideas died because they could not overcome institutional barriers. How many lives could have been saved? How many wars shortened? How many diseases cured? If we had listened more carefully to the mechanics, the nurses, the farmers, the truck drivers, who sometimes see problems more clearly than the experts. And there is one final detail that most people have never heard. In 1978, when the API program was finally declassified, a researcher at the National Archives discovered something extraordinary. Inside a sealed file marked Russo Anthony J. Technical Investigations was a single sheet of paper. Handwritten, dated January 22, 1944. The same night Russo's Midnight team had first successfully fired their prototype API rounds at captured German armor plating. It was a letter, addressed to Russo's mother. It had never been sent. In the letter, Russo described what he had just witnessed in the test bunker. He wrote that the new bullets had worked, that they would save American lives. He wrote that he knew he might be court-martialed for what he had done. He wrote that he did not care. He ended the letter with a single sentence that historians have quoted ever since. "Mama, if I go to prison for this, I want you to know I did it for the boys who won't come home otherwise. Their mothers deserve to see them again too." The letter was never sent because Russo feared intercepted mail might expose the program. He kept it in his footlocker throughout the war. When the Army took custody of his personal effects during the sabotage investigation in 1944, the letter was filed with his records and forgotten for 34 years. His mother, who died in 1969, never read it. His children read it for the first time in 1989. His daughter Marie donated the original to the Smithsonian in 2003. It sits today in a climate-controlled archive in Washington. Evidence that behind every technology, there is usually a human being, a son, a mother, a reason to risk everything. From a 31-year-old mechanic with an idea everyone called insane to the most influential ammunition design of the 20th century. Tony Russo proved that one determined person, armed with knowledge, courage, and moral clarity, can change the outcome of the largest conflict in human history. His bullets saved over 12,000 American lives in World War II alone. His technology influenced every major air war for the next 80 years. And his quiet, uncredited example reminds us that innovation is not reserved for the famous, the credentialed, or the powerful. Sometimes it comes from a Pittsburgh garage, a midnight bunker, and a stubborn refusal to accept that good enough is actually good enough. If you know a story like this, an untold history about an ordinary person who did something extraordinary, share it in the comments below. These stories deserve to be remembered. This is just one of hundreds of forgotten innovations from World War II that quietly shaped the modern world. Subscribe to discover the rest. because history is not written by the famous. History is written by the people brave enough to try what everyone else called impossible. Tony Russo never asked to be remembered, but he deserves to be. And now you know his name.